Just in now. Yeah. Cool. So hello and welcome everybody to this latest Change in Planet seminar. Today we're in conversation with Tim Jackson, who's author of the book Post-Growth, Life After Capitalism. This seminar series is run by myself and Ben, who are first year DTP students on Science and Solutions for a Change in Planet. And we're also joined by Ari Crocker today as a guest co-host of the seminar. To stay up to date with our latest events, our mailing list, our newsletters, what we get up on social media. Ben's going to put some links to that down into the chat for people today. So let me introduce myself at the beginning. I'm Patrick. As I said, I'm on the DTP. I'll be chairing the event alongside Abby. And there's a few little housekeeping things that need to be done. So you join muted. Please stay muted for the duration of the seminar. Please endeavour, we would like you to keep your cameras on just so we can see you for most of it. But you will have the opportunity to ask questions at the end of the seminar. So please do write them in the chat, add your affiliation because we'd love to know where you're from. And we will come back to you at the end of the seminar. So the way the format of this one's going to take is going to be a 40 to 45 minutes conversation with me, Abby and Tim, and then 10, 15 minutes for audience engagement at the end. So it's my pleasure to introduce the speaker for today, Professor Tim Jackson. He is an ecological economist and writer, and since 2016, he has been director of the Centre for Understanding of Sustainable Prosperity, CUSP, at the University of Surrey in the UK, where he is also Professor of Sustainable Development. From 2004 to 2011, he was Economics Commissioner for the UK Sustainable Development Commission, where his work culminated in the publication of Prosperity Without Growth, which has subsequently been translated into 17 foreign languages. It was named as the Financial Times Book of the Year in 2010 and UnHerd's Economics Book of the Decade in 2019. In 2016, Tim was awarded the Hillary Laureate for exceptional international leadership and sustainability, in addition to his academic work. Tim is an award-winning dramatist with numerous radio writing credits for the BBC. And with the culmination of all this work, his latest book, and the reason we're having this discussion today, is Post-Growth, Life After Capitalism. So to begin with, we'd like to welcome Tim, ask him, how are you?
Very good. Thank you, Patrick. Thank you, Abby. Thank you, Ben. Thanks for having me on the seminar. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Yeah, amazing. So I found this book to be quite inspiring and really thought-provoking in the way that it addresses the issue that many other books have endeavored to do, which is look at how we rethink our economic system in a time where we have these sort of seminal existential problems around us. But it took a different perspective where it actually looked at the philosophical exploration of the incompatibility of our current economic system and how this is incompatible with our human condition, our human ability to realize its fullest potential. I'd just like to ask, what was your inspiration and motivation to write this book in a more philosophically focused inspection of capitalism and how it affects our human condition?
Yeah, thanks, Patrick. As you sort of pointed out in my biography at the beginning, it's the kind of area that I've worked in for quite a long time, particularly the challenge of economic growth, the challenge of the economic system, how we have to kind of revise that, and that's a challenge that's been picked up by lots and lots of people, and in particular the sort of what I would call the post-growth challenge has been picked up in the decade since Prosperity Without Growth is published. It's been picked up in all sorts of different ways, and I guess what I felt was missing in a sense was something that was a more widely accessible narrative, something that ordinary people could kind of pick up. So Prosperity Without Growth was essentially it started its life as a policy document, as a document to the UK government. And from there it turned into, in the end, what was probably better received by a wider audience, a book that people wanted to read. I'm not sure that the government of the day really did pick it up or any of its recommendations up very seriously. But it was still a kind of policy document. And I think that work is important. I think the work of, understanding technology is important, the understanding of economics, and a lot of our work at the University of Surrey and the Centre for the Understanding of Sustainable Prosperity focuses on that sort of detailed work, those detailed questions. And a lot of people doing PhDs will be very familiar with, how much you have to drill down into those questions, how much you have to pay attention to detail, how much you have to focus your attention on one particular or another particular aspect of it. And I kind of felt that over the years and the years that I've been working on it, I had amassed a broader perspective on that, and the perspective, as you say, that sort of relates the question of how we live on a finite planet to deeper questions, deeper philosophical questions about who we are, what kind of species the human species is, how we want to live and what it means to live well, and to the fundamental aspects of the human condition. And it occurred to me, not just that story around post-growth hadn't really been written, but that there were loads of people through time, through history, who had said fantastically interesting things about it. So post-growth is a sort of attempt to do justice to both those things. First, to tell a more accessible story for ordinary people who don't really like, reading policy documents and aren't interested in graphs and charts, but for whom this is still a very live question. And also to point to this kind of undercurrent of thought, which in some sense I think we can think of as countercultural. It's lain there for decades, centuries, possibly even millennia, and its richness is available to us now as we think through the challenges that we now face. And that's kind of what I was trying to do with post-growth.
Yeah, no, fantastic. I think that leads on quite nicely to Abby's question.
It's sort of reiterating what Patrick said. I find the book, it's approached in a really interesting way, because you sort of explore all these theories and narratives through famous works and inspirational people, and they inform actually much of the book. So when you begin the book in Myth of Growth, you quote Bobby Kennedy in his 1968 speech in Kansas, and you say, "Too much for too long, we seem to have surrendered personal excellence and community values in the mere accumulation of material things." And then just over 50 years later, you quote Greta Thunberg, speaking at the UN Climate Conference, saying, "We are in the beginning of a mass extinction, and all you can talk about is money and fairy tales of eternal economic growth." So sort of thinking about these quotes and how they were stated 50 years apart, can you please explain to us this notion of the myth of growth and sort of the social construction and persistence of the modern economy, and this kind of paradoxical myth between perpetual growth and a finite planet?
Yeah, of course. I mean, it is interesting. I think that I start with that Bobby Kennedy quote partly because it speaks right to the agenda of what we're measuring, what we think growth is, and the limitations, not just in statistical terms. When we measure the growth through the GDP, the gross domestic product, for example, it has all these failings. It misses out a whole bunch of stuff. It doesn't include things that really matter. And Bobby Kennedy at one point said, it measures everything, in short, except that which makes life worthwhile. And that was 50 years ago. And yet, as you say, 53 years later, we're still in a position where we're kind of chasing after growth. And that's the point at which you think, there's something deeper going on here. There's something cultural going on. There's something about the way we think about social progress. There's something about the way we define ourselves. There's something about the way we organize our economy that's all being driven in a systematic way. And that's kind of what I mean by the myth of growth. I'm not being unkind about it, because I think every culture essentially has a myth that sort of guides what it's doing and tells people what the good life is, and points us in the direction of progress. And for a long time, our myth, our cultural myth, has been this myth of growth, and it's been very deeply ingrained. And even though Bobby Kennedy was able to say that in 1968, and to some extent, his remarks have sparked off some debates about, the statistics of the GDP and how we measure things and stuff like that, the deeper critique kind of went missing. So it was still there to be articulated when Greta Thunberg turns up at the UN Climate Conference. And she said it absolutely kind of as it is. It's like a fairy tale. It's a myth. It's a story. It's a sort of, we've been gaslighted by growth in some sense. And that's the point at which we have to kind of think, we have to think more deeply about what that means, why we've done that, how it was institutionalized, what the alternatives are, and then to some extent, what a different story might be that would point us in a different direction.
Yeah, no, fascinating. I think my question will lead on to that as well, and saying, this myth of growth and how we adapt to these existential problems. And I was at a World Biodiversity Forum meeting recently that was rethinking economics and finance for biodiversity. And they were very much advocating for not getting rid of growth, but sort of changing the way capitalism growth works into, say, green growth. So this is sort of upping our investment in, upping our impact investment in industries that have quantifiable benefit for society. And it was a convincing argument where I was like, yeah, this would be great if we could do it. So do you think if there, in your critique of capitalism, is there anything that you would carry over to a post-growth world?
I mean, I think yes, of course. I mean, let me tell you sort of a little bit about, put this in context a little bit, particularly the green growth thing in context. So when I started out working, I started working actually for Greenpeace, and it was at a time just after Chernobyl blew up. And, you know, I was kind of looking around me thinking there must be better systems, there must be better technologies. And I immediately fell into looking at the renewables. So very early on, I was looking at the economics of renewables and trying to kind of make the case for them. And even at that point in time, with the technologies still not as developed as they are today, those technologies were all basically things that could have been developed and could have been, you know, extended and improved with R&D, and could have been implemented in ways that, you know, would make something as dangerous and long lasting, you know, with long damages to society like nuclear power is, would have made them unnecessary. And in fact, early on, I gave evidence to that effect at a version of the Hinkley Point inquiry that for a while put a moratorium on the progress of nuclear growth, because it was blindingly obvious that there were these technologies. We could decarbonize, we could implement renewable energy, there were efficiencies to be made, and lots of them were much cheaper than investing in nuclear technology, whose wastes we have to look after for millennia and don't even know how to do that. So I firmly believe in that power of technology. And so when the green growth advocates come along and they say, look, you know, all these technologies exist, and actually they're sometimes cheaper than fossil fuel alternatives, and they're safer than nuclear power, and they're things that we could invest in now. Yes, and yes, all of those things are true. And I guess, you know, a part of my perspective is having watched for 30-something years how that didn't happen and why it didn't happen. And a lot of the reasons why it didn't happen was that the focus of policy, the focus of attention, the focus of economists most of the time was always actually on the fastest productivity growth, the cheapest gain, and the biggest output, so that we could push the growth frontier. And so in a sense, what I'm saying is that's the critical thing that we have to drop. It's not that we don't do technology anymore. It's not that we don't believe in efficiency anymore. It is that by simply arguing that we grow the economy as fast as we can and green it as fast as we can at the same time, we're kind of putting ourselves in a sort of race between efficiency and scale, between an economy that's growing and growing with an efficiency that has to improve faster and faster, and we're not seeing progress. And that's a point, I think, at which we have to think more deeply, we have to dig more deeply, we have to find out why that's not happening, we have to confront the obstacles, we have to confront politicians with that obsession with growth and say, yes, we believe in this technology, we believe that a green economy is possible, but it isn't happening under these structures, under these circumstances, when we know that we have to decarbonize in the space of little more than a decade. And that's the challenge, I think. That's the deeper challenge that I think we have to take seriously, alongside being able to believe in technology as a part of a future. I'm not dissing that at all. I think it's really important, but I want that deeper discussion too.
Yeah, no, of course. No, I completely agree with you. And just sort of recognizing the urgency is something that really needs to happen. But I think just a quick sort of follow up on that, where you were saying we need to be holding these governments to account, and quite a theme within your book was sort of getting at that civil disobedience in a way. How would you suggest that maybe us within the academic field or whoever else is listening, how do we do our own sort of peaceful civil disobedience to get this urgent change that is necessary?
Well, you know, Extinction Rebellion, I think today or yesterday, just launched a tax rebellion, which is really interesting because the idea of withholding your taxes was one of the places where civil disobedience was first mentioned. It was mentioned by Thoreau back in the middle of the 19th century. I'm hoping my dates are right. And he basically sort of said, I'm not paying taxes to a government that's spending them fighting a war in Mexico that I do not believe in. And he characterized that idea that the legitimacy of government stops at the point at which it is no longer representing the interests of ordinary people and the best interests of ordinary people, and in particular, the best interests of the weakest and most vulnerable ordinary people in society. And so I do spend a little bit of time on that. And it turns out that it's got a really long pedigree. For as long as we've been talking about government, we've been talking about the limitations of government. And those limitations exist when those best interests are no longer being represented. And at that point, the legitimacy of government actually stops. And there's a returned mandate in philosophical, in moral terms. A mandate is returned to the people to do something about the fact that their interests aren't being represented, the interests of future generations aren't being represented, and actually the government that they have elected has failed in its legitimacy as a promise to the future. And you find that in the philosophy of John Locke, you find it in the writings of Mahatma Gandhi, you find it in Thoreau, you find it in the writings of Martin Luther King, you find it in all of these people who just kind of understood that there's a point at which, as citizens, we have to stand up and be counted in different ways. And I'm not I don't think I'm advocating a specific way in which any individual does that. I think, particularly for you as academics starting out your career, looking for influence in the world, there are so many different options available. Some of them are doing your research and changing the way that we understand the dimensions of the problem. Some of them are then moving into businesses where you work as a kind of like a Trojan horse, if you like. You kind of inside the beast and you change it from within. Some of them are about the way you behave in your personal lives and the choices that you make there and where you invest and whether you withdraw your taxes or not. Some of them are about getting out on the street and showing your voice and making your voice heard. And so I don't want to be prescriptive about who does what in that, because different people, it's different things for different people. Who would ever imagine that a 15-year-old schoolgirl would become a messenger of hope for an entire generation by sitting on the steps of Parliament saying nothing all day for months through the winter of 2018? And that changed the world, that one action, and it brought attention to the climate emergency, and governments did take notice. And even in the UK, actually, we have a net zero target, I would argue, precisely because of that civil disobedience.
Yeah, it really was incredible to see the influence.
So sort of like thinking about bringing these ideas together about the technological innovations and sort of like society. In your book, you highlight obviously Earth's finite limits to growth. And recently there's been a huge surge in this sort of eco-modernism, where like humans believe that they can decouple from nature through human ingenuity and innovation and just grow indefinitely. So in your book, you also mention how when you mentioned the limits to growth theory in Whitehall, you received quite a lot of criticism. So I was just wondering whether you could tell us about this and actually how prevalent these ideas in society are, that we can decouple from nature, that they believe that we can just, exist indefinitely without the environment.
Yeah, they are prevalent. I mean, they're more prevalent in economics, I think, than they are anywhere else, which is a bit of a savage indictment of economics itself. They're definitely prevalent in policy. I think, that experience that I recount in the book of, after Prosperity Without Growth is published, taking it as a government advisor into government, finding these people who would actually, I don't remember if I put it in post-growth, but I definitely recounted it in Prosperity Without Growth, of one situation where I was talking about limits, and an economist from, I think it was the industry department, whatever that was called at that time, basically stood up and said that he thought, limits were economically illiterate. There's no such thing as limits. And you'll find that idea that there's no such thing as limits, that goes way back, and it certainly goes back as far as the Limits to Growth report. So think about the history of that a little bit. The Limits to Growth report was published in 1972. It was pointing out something that's pretty obvious in a way. If you keep on consuming resources, you run out of planet. And you would think, that would be a fairly straightforward thing to say, but it turned out not to be. I mean, the report was kind of ridiculed, lampooned, misunderstood, people misrepresented it. And you even had the president of the United States at that time, or shortly afterwards, Ronald Reagan, standing up saying there's no such thing as limits. There's no such thing as limits because there's no limits to human ingenuity, creativity and passion, or something like that. I can't remember what exactly the three commodities were. So he was sort of saying something. And what's interesting, he was saying something recognizable. We do think we are a very ingenious species. We do think we are very creative, and we are creative. And there's aspects of our lives that are unlimited. But that unlimited creativity that exists and is a reality of the human condition always has to be filtered through a material lens, a lens of what the physical world really looks like. And that's the point at which we go wrong if we think that everything is unlimited. So one of the core arguments in post-growth actually was to make that distinction, what's limited and what's limitless, and to argue that actually to find the limitless things, we have to pay attention to the limits. We're not allowed to just ignore them. If we do it at our peril. We shouldn't just try and bludgeon our way through them, because if we do, we could be creating all sorts of damage. We should certainly think about how we adapt to them. And in adapting to them, we learn actually, and we apply this creativity, and we find the places in the world which are limitless. Our ability to have good relationships with each other, our desire for meaning and purpose in life, our sense of social progress, our pursuit of lives that are fulfilling and are egalitarian. Even some of our kind of, you could almost call them spiritual goals, or goals about transcendental goals, if you like, that lie beyond our sense of an immediate working life. That is all unlimited, but we don't find it by bludgeoning our way through the material limits of the physical world. We find it by accepting those limits and working our way into this unlimited space of creativity in the human soul.
I think that idea is really interesting, and it really comes across in one of your chapters when you talk about who killed capitalism, and you draw on the works of Rosa Luxemburg, who assumes the relentless drive for profit in capitalism could only be satisfied by the continual exploitation of non-capitalist regions, which ultimately results in violent imperialism. But then also you kind of say, however, where does this expansionary drive come from, and what are the origins of this imperative, this growth imperative, sort of is embedded in capitalism? And I was just wondering whether that kind of expansionary drive could potentially be invested elsewhere. How do we kind of achieve that?
Yeah, I think it can. I mean, I think it can even be invested inside capitalism for now. And I think in some ways that's what we have to do. We have to build the places inside the economy, expand the places inside the economy that are going to bring us to the economy of tomorrow. And paradoxically, you can find very successful companies, very successful banks, very successful financial institutions, very successful community institutions who are doing that. They are growing a space inside capitalism where something different is happening, where purpose takes precedent over profit, where profits are reinvested in communities, where communities strengthen social relations, and where individualism, although it's still an important aspect of our lives, is not allowed to trump the common good. And so actually, that ability to grow that space is an incredible thing to focus on. And it's allowed a lot of the people that I've worked with over the years and written with over the years and been involved with over the years to create incredible initiatives that are beginning to change the economy, change the relationships between communities and individuals, and even influence policy itself. And those, so there's all of the lots of lovely examples of places when you're inside a dysfunctional system, your job is to plant the seeds of the functional one. And that planting of seeds is a place where you can watch and nourish and nurture the growth of that alternative system as it becomes the economy of tomorrow. And I firmly believe that process actually of kind of nurturing the economy of tomorrow is something that anybody can engage in, because there is massive potential for that particular kind of growth.
Fascinating. I sort of want to expand on sort of nurturing the economy for tomorrow, and how our sort of current economic system is in conflict with our human condition and and how it addresses the concept of suffering in a completely different way to the way we might want an economy to function. Capitalism, as you say, addresses suffering in the way of advocating for increased competition and at the expense of other people in the community. What do you envision as this new economy that we want to nurture, and how it gets away from that competitive response to suffering?
Yeah, I mean, this touches on some of the deeply philosophical bits of the book in some ways, but we know pretty much already that capitalism is a very competitive thing. It prizes competition. It prizes the competition of the free market, in which, you know, the social good is supposed to come from everybody pursuing their own self-interest. We've seen how that's gone badly wrong, how dysfunctional it's become, and we're in a state now where what we need to do is to kind of confront the depth of those roots, and then find a different route out. And I think actually, you know, a simple answer to your question, there's a more complicated one in the book, but a simple answer to your question is that we've learned a really profound lesson through the pandemic itself. We've learned in particular that capitalism has poorly treated, mistreated, undervalued, underpaid, created insecure livelihoods for the most important people in society, the people who protected our health on the front line, the people who provide us with work, with the means of provision of living, if you like, the kind of shop workers, the distribution workers, even the cleaners in society. Those basic people in society have been poorly treated by capitalism, and above all, of course, the doctors and the nurses and the health workers. So capitalism has delivered us a health system that was ill prepared for a pandemic, and it relied on the goodwill, on the faith of a section of the community who were absolutely essential to us and to our health, who had been neglected over not just pre-pandemic, not just since the financial crisis, but actually over, you know, decades. And that's a huge failing of capitalism. It also points us in the direction of kind of, you know, how we want to build out from there. Instead of that competitive, devil may care, winner takes all, ruthless society that capitalism you muted the wrong person. I think there was somebody creating a little bit of interference, but it wasn't me. So I kind of want to say that, you know, in place of that competitive ethic, if you like, there's an ethic of care. And, you know, in a world in which health suddenly became the most important aspect of prosperity, the idea that the most fundamental transition that we have to make is towards an economy of care has a very particular resonance, because care is what we need in order to promote prosperity without health. And those two lessons from the crisis, you know, point me in that direction. And the more philosophical argument that I talk about in the book, this sort of comparison with, you know, Buddhism in a sense, I think to some extent points in the same direction, because it points to the idea of compassion in the face of suffering as a better response to suffering than competition that tries to, you know, ensure that if anyone's suffering, it's not me.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more that we need to sort of have this compassion in the face of suffering rather than to the detriment of other people. Abby?
So it's interesting in your book how you sort of draw upon this idea of a decline in society for entropy, and how you draw on Boltzmann's interpretation about how things move from a more orderly state to a more chaotic state rather than the other way around. And you mentioned how life itself is evidence of order, but in trying to achieve this order, the energy used becomes less and less available. And portray this in the book, you do draw on sort of human health and the nutrition crisis. So I was just wondering if you could share with everybody this kind of idea, this nutrition crisis that we're facing, and also kind of the entropy that also is kind of embedded in our society.
Yeah, I mean, I think the point about Boltzmann, he's kind of what he's saying really, and what the entropy law says is that you can purchase order, you can purchase good health, you can purchase, a decent life, you can purchase tidiness in your room, you can purchase an ordered society around you, but you can only do it at a price, and the price is what physicists call free energy, this availability of energy. And every time you use this free available energy to create order in one place, the second law of thermodynamics says that you have to increase disorder elsewhere. And so it's a really interesting way of thinking about things. I mean, you can think about it, in very simple ways, like, if you really want a tidy room all the time, you've got to put the time and energy into that, because otherwise it's going to naturally, as things move and as things move through the system, it's going to become untidy. And so every time you take your earpod, we all have earpods now instead of, although I still have these, because I still trust the sound goes through this little wire more than it does through the ether. But every time I put them away and I take them out again, it's always muddled. I never put them away muddled and it comes out tidy. There's a tendency in the world towards this state of disorder. And so that's a physical view of the universe, which puts our relationship to physical material things in a particular context. And it says, purchase the things that you really, really want. Don't waste all this stuff. Don't waste all this energy on things that aren't actually increasing human happiness, that aren't delivering human fulfillment, that aren't allowing you relationships of integrity with your family, and that ultimately also aren't messing up your nutrition and indeed your health. And it is, as you said, it's a key example in the book. And it's a very particular example because And I think this is a quite frightening statistic from the World Health Organization, that more people in the world die today of diseases of overnutrition, of overconsumption, of lifestyle diseases, of obesity and diabetes and heart conditions and lung conditions that are brought on from actually not having a deficiency of food, but actually having an excess of food and having the wrong kinds of food. And so what I draw out of that in the book is that there's a kind, that prosperity itself is a kind of balance, just like our health is a balance. If we haven't got enough, if we're chronically undernourished, we need more. But at the point actually at which, we do have enough and we are fit and our bodies are healthy and they are working well, that's the point at which we need to stop having more and actually focus on that balance. And the point that I make in the book is that capitalism is not very good at doing that, because it's always pushing for more. And so the idea of balance is an anathema. Capitalism itself is pushing us towards crises of obesity and overnutrition and non-communicable diseases, lifestyle diseases, as the WHO calls them, because it does not know where that point is, that point of balance, and it has no way of stopping when we get there. And so that's that's a way, if you like, of sort of giving us another sense in which the economy of tomorrow and the sense of social progress is about finding that balance and returning our attention to that balance in ourselves as physical organisms, in our mental states, in our activities, in our communities, and indeed our balance with the planet itself. And to me, it's a very powerful guiding metaphor that points in a very clear direction that is not about more and more and more. It is the beginnings of that myth, if you like, a different cultural myth about what social progress should be.
Yeah, again, really interesting. I want to sort of develop on that point. And you mentioned in the book, it was something that was really one of the more profound sort of realizations I got when I was reading it, that this pursuit for more, materialistic things to the detriment of the planet, is really a avoidance of suffering and a fear of our own mortality and a fear of death. And it's getting into the more philosophical points towards it, but I'd love for you to expand more on that point. Yeah,
that's a kind of, it is a sort of sub theme through the book, and it's an idea that again that's been echoed throughout the ages, really, that lots of different ways, I suppose, of approaching it. Perhaps one of the easiest ones is through the story of Hannah Arendt, who I employ to sort of tell the story of work. And in a book called The Human Condition, which she published in 1957, she was distinguished between different kinds of activities that we undertake in the world. And the most obvious kinds of activities that we undertake are to feed ourselves and nourish ourselves and look after ourselves, the labor of care. And she distinguished that idea, all of those things that keep us healthy and keep us sane and keep us nourished and keep a roof over our head, those basic things she talked about as labor. And she talked also about how capitalism degrades those jobs in just the same way that I was talking about how capitalism had degraded the jobs of the health workers that protected our lives. We kind of think they're not that important, and we think they're not that important because they don't contribute massively to productivity, and productivity is what delivers us growth. And so that sense of them, their poor position in society being locked in by capitalism was something that Hannah Arendt was talking about. But she was also saying, and it's a very interesting thing, at one point she sort of says, actually, this labor, this regenerative labor that we have to be engaged in, which can be exhausting because it has to be sometimes physical, or it has to be, the emotional care of small children or elderly grandparents or parents, that this is an exhausting thing. And yet it's perhaps the closest we get to happiness, because we work in the careful delivery of the care of our lives, and we do it in a way that exhausts us. And then when we stop, we have the bliss of kind of recovery from it, and then we start again in a society, and that's all that we're doing. And we start and we're immersed in task. We're always immersed in task, and actually being immersed in a task is actually a place where you're not even thinking about happiness. And that's one of her points. Happiness is something that happens when you don't really think about it too much. And the place where you don't think about it too much is where you're immersed in the task itself, which is a really, really interesting reflection. And of course, one of the things we've tried to do in modern society for quite a long time, and I'm not saying this is a bad thing, is get rid of that kind of work. We don't want to do that kind of grunt work too much. We want to delegate it if it does come up. We want to pay people poorly to do it for us so that we can get on with a much more exciting, sexy, productivity enhancing things of having more technology and having very, very exciting social media lives and so on and so forth. And so, Arendt's point was that nonetheless, that labor of care is a very honest place in the world, because it is what gives us and sustains health for us and for those around us. It's a place where we can exercise compassion, and it's a place where actually, we're not thinking too much about happiness. We're not sweating that stuff at all, because the really important things are what we're focused on. And then she sort of says a really interesting thing, that in freeing ourselves from that, capitalism and consumerism to some extent has done us a service, because we're not just grunt work all the time, and we're not exhausted all the time, and we do get up the next day and have space to think and to do something different. But she says it's also a disservice or a problem for humankind, because as soon as you have that space to think, you start worrying about the fact that you're going to die, and you worry about what other people are going to think of you before you die, and you worry about what you're going to achieve before you die, and you wonder if your friends like you anymore, and you wonder what your profile is like on social media, and you wonder why you don't have as many followers as the person next door has. So you're drawn immediately into what there's a psychologist called Sheldon Solomon who talks about the worm at the core of human existence, which is our fear of death and the ways in which we respond to that. And Arendt's answer to how we respond to that is that we engage in what she calls work, as distinct from labor. And that work is the work of building durability, of building permanence, of building legacy, of building something that will last, building something that will provide a sense of security against the inevitability of our own demise. And the most punishing thing of all is that capitalism's destroyed that too, because durability and permanence and security is the last things that capitalism wants. Capitalism wants us to consume more, to crave novelty, to throw out the old stuff as fast as possible, just so that we can keep the system going. And so in both cases, capitalism's response to both the basics of keeping ourselves alive and indeed our own fear of mortality, both cases is this kind of headlong rush towards more and more novelty, faster and faster. And it forms a kind of denial. It represents a sort of denial of the human condition. And it doesn't do us any favors. It doesn't make us happier. It makes us more materialistic. That undermines our well-being. It undermines and trashes the planet. It undermines the core commodities of work, the fulfillment that work can bring, and it undermines that labor of care that allows us to sustain human dignity and human existence at all. So it's, you know, it's a very profound critique, and it's obviously not everybody's cup of tea to think about death all the time. I'm not suggesting we necessarily do that, but it's quite fascinating to find that underneath capitalism lies this rumbling fear of death and horror and tragedy, and that much of what we do through our lives is an attempt either to deny that, or in fact to understand it and to work out strategies through which we can actually, much as we were talking about with limits and unlimited, work around and through the limit of our own temporal existence on the planet, the fact that we're only here for a few years, in order to find the unlimited capacities that exist within us nonetheless.
Yes, amazing. And I think just actually recognizing your own mortality just makes you present into your own experiences and makes you there in the moment. And that's what's going to actually get you into that. I know you mentioned the book, I don't think we have time to get into now, but flow, get you into that state of flow, getting into that sort of, getting the most fulfilling state that a human can get into. I think, well, we've got a quarter of an hour now. Abby, would you like to ask your final question, and then we can move on to a Q&A?
Yeah. I just have one final question that I find quite interesting, and you spoke about it quite early on in this conversation about identity. And I find it really interesting how sort of capitalism and sort of globalization has merged identities globally, and whether, you know, is a post-growth human condition based on utilitarian principles. Will trying to achieve this, do we then try and form another identity? And in the process of kind of achieving this post-growth world, will humans, as it's been so embedded in our sort of system for a while, sort of try and create like another sphere of an organizing society where almost happiness becomes the competition? And how do we as humans sort of engage with this idea of flow and balance without turning a post-growth world into an equally competitive state, basically? And how have we kind of lost identity there?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very important question. I mean, I think, you know, and it's very true that when you think in terms of transition of one state or one idea or one organizing principle to another, there's a danger of kind of chaos, there's a danger of disruption, there's a danger of actually slipping into worse states. So if you think about the kind of rise of totalitarianism in the early 20th century, it was in some sense, it was a response to the kind of demise of an aristocratic, almost feudal way of thinking about governance. And it led to some profoundly dystopian outcomes. So actually, you know, in some ways, I think the job for anyone who's engaged on this now is to really keep that as a watchword, you know, to watch out for that danger where you're slipping from one dark, dysfunctional place into something that's even worse. But it seems to me that, you know, if we keep our eyes on the prize, if we keep our eyes on what human happiness is, and we keep our eyes framed on what the human condition is, if we think of limits as being a gateway to the limitless, if we think of our own potentials as being unlimited in social and relational and psychological and perhaps even spiritual terms, then we have the basis from which to build, I guess, what I think is the foundations of that transition, which is diversity, which is not, you know, the crumbling of one facade in order to build another equally monolithic cage for our identity, but actually to celebrate the diversity of different cultures. And again, that was part of what I was trying to do in Postgrowth, was to bring voices from very different cultures through history to articulate that idea that the richness of the human condition actually cannot be caged by capitalism, cannot be caged by consumerism, and is ours as a right to pursue as we best can.
It's so interesting. Thank you so much for answering all our questions. I think Patrick and I were both talking about the book a couple of days ago, and we both said a quote each that really like resonated and kind of sort of concluded the book really nicely. Is when you quote Lao Tzu's quote, "That's enough's enough is enough to know." I love that quote. And Patrick also had one that was also equally like sort of inspiring.
Yeah. So I was looking at Shaw's quotes and just looking at the sort of the monumental tasks that we have ahead of us going post-pandemic, and obviously the climate and biodiversity crisis in front of us. And Shaw's quote was saying, you see things as they are and you say why, but I dream things that never were, and I say why not? And this is sort of, why not create a new revolutionary economic system that is nurturing all, where we recognize their limits and allow us to fulfill our greatest potential. So I think that was just one of the quotes that stayed with me when I was reading the book. I think I'll move on to a couple of questions from the audience now. And Emily had a question about sort of how we value natural capital and value nature. Emily, if you want to unmute yourself and ask a question.
Thanks so much. Hi, Tim. Thanks for a great seminar, and I look forward to reading your second book. I hope you're keeping really well. So one of the things that I've come across a few times in my work is this kind of move towards valuing nature and the natural capital agenda. I worry that that's a slight commercialization or turning nature into, putting it into capitalism as a market rather than valuing nature for the more, well, its own value, its own rights, as it were, rather than a monetary value. So I think this word's a bit corrupt, like sustainable development got a bit guided in one direction as well. So I'd be interested to hear if you had any thoughts on how that's moving now in that debate, that discussion arena. But also, I think it's really easy for us to get a sense of what we don't want, what we want to move away from. And I'm still wrestling when people say to me, what does a sustainable life look like? Or what is this? My son's now studying economics and psychology, and we wrestle all the time because he's a pure capitalist. But I can't point him towards what is a better alternative that's functioning now, or even a model of it. And I'd be really delighted to hear your views on that. I know you're doing some scoping work in CEP on futures. So if you've got something from there that's come to fruition now, that would be great. Thanks.
Thanks, Emily. Yeah, two big questions, really. I mean, on the natural capital thing, I would point you maybe to the debate that we had inside CUSP on that, on the CUSP website, cusp.ac.uk. And there was a seminar that we had, really interesting seminar between a philosopher called Roger Scruton and I've lost the name of the other person in my head, but if you search for Roger Scruton, you'll find that where the two people were having a conversation about whether natural capital was even a term that we should allow. And there was a very interesting point at which Roger Scruton, who held that it was, and that we should value things, and that would help because capitalism works and it can, guide our protection of nature, sort of at one point sort of turned around and said, you've convinced me, John, I'm not ever going to use that term anymore. I'm not suggesting that we don't use the term anymore, because I know that politically it's quite a useful thing to do. But I think as we do, we have to think very, very carefully about that kind of colonization of nature that capitalism is all too geared up for, that's all too happy to do for us. And creating markets around natural values could actually be deeply destructive to the environment. But that's not to say that we shouldn't think about the protection of nature. We should think about it, and we should think about it as an asset. We should think about it as having its own value. We should think about it as something we invest in, but we should not sort of try to internalize it totally as a commodity within capitalism, because that's quite dangerous. On the question of futures, yes, I mean, and to some extent, Postgrowth does try to do that, and it tries to sort of pitch, a vision of the future in which we prioritize the things that really enrich the human condition, our relationships, our community, the strength of our bonds with our family, our aspirations to be a part of society. I see it as a place where people have more social agency, where they are engaged in the building of society, in the work of building the future, and in which they also, have the space for creative expression and development that doesn't depend inherently on material things. And one of the very strong arguments in the book is that this condition of flow that Patrick and Abigail mentioned actually is one of the most satisfying conditions that human beings can engage in. And it's actually, the evidence suggests that actually it's having material lives and having materialistic content in our lives inhibits reaching that side of ourselves. It stands in the way of the fullest expression of human fulfillment. And so, you know, I would, in terms of your son and your son being a capitalist, we're all capitalists. We live in a capitalist society. We live in a consumerist society. We're kind of embedded and encultured in that sense of what progress is. And we have to unlearn that. We have to free ourselves from it. We have to kind of unconsume, sometimes even in order to see these spaces where this fulfillment lies. And that makes it a very difficult thing to say, well, this is what post-capitalism looks like. But it does tell us what the next bit of the journey is about. It's about the pursuit of that idea and the articulation of it and the building of the opportunities for it and the building of opportunities for your son and your grandkids after them of a different kind of sense of what the good life is. And to me, that's a better life. It's a richer life. It's a more fulfilling life. And that's kind of what, you know, what I sketch out a little bit. That vision of a possibility is what I sketch out in the book.
Okay, thank you very much, Tim. Next question is something that I was thinking about when we were talking about value in natural capital, about what replaces GDP. But instead of me asking a question, Mike Schaff has got a question for you. We can't hear you, Michael, unfortunately. If you don't mind, do you mind if I read it out? If growth is not the right target for policy, which I very much agree with, what should replace per capita GDP as a criterion and an incentive for policymakers? There is a big debate among economists and others on beyond GDP. Do you think any of them have a good answer? One that could actually work in actual political debate, and essentially that would appeal to those who have less comfortable lives than most of us who are attending the seminar.
Yeah, I mean, there's a very interesting point on that point of, you know, does it appeal to most comfortable lives? I mean, one of the reasons, one of the points where we saw the myth begin to fall apart was during the Brexit debate. And I recount this incident in the book of an economist going out to a meeting to persuade people to vote against Brexit because of the damage it would cause for the GDP. And a woman from the crowd shouted, "It's your bloody GDP, it's not ours." So one thing that's really interesting is that myth no longer works for people. People don't believe in it. They don't think the growth benefits them. They don't see the growth benefiting from them. And they don't even understand, I would argue, even what that kind of GDP growth really means. So I think in a way there is, yes, a much easier way to talk about what we want in the future, to talk about it as in terms of health, in terms of well-being, in terms of good balance, in terms of opportunity, in terms of fulfillment, in terms of fulfilling lives. And that what we need in order to guide policy towards that is frameworks that are both resonant and informative about that direction of travel. They would elevate indicators like, you know, various indicators of the health of the population. They would elevate those above the GDP in exactly the way that they did through the crisis, but in a more systematic, thought out way. What are the objectives that we're going to pursue? They would elevate aspects of education, the ability to learn how to engage in activities that give us flow, that contribute to the community, that encourage social action, that strengthen community. And that points us in the direction of indicators that, you know, are around policy and engagement and education and opportunity. And what I think, you know, there's quite a lot, and I've been engaged in it myself for quite a long time, is about the indicators debate, about the beyond GDP debate. And there's various ways that you can go. The GDP might still be a useful indicator in terms of understanding the structure of your economy. It's a very bad indicator in terms of the well-being of your society. And so it seems to me that the debate around well-being and about well-being indicators is quite a fruitful one. And the places where that's been taken most furthest forward, like in New Zealand and Scotland actually, and Finland and a couple of other governments, those discussions have tended to be, they got a bit thwarted during the pandemic, but just prior to the pandemic, there was quite a build-up of momentum around a different way of measuring what that progress is. And I think that's very fertile. I think it has to be a place that we return our attentions to as soon as we can.
Thank you very much. I think we've got time for about one more question. So thank you, Tim, for staying with us this far. We're going to take up too much more of your time.
You want to give me just, if you want to give me sort of 2 or 3, I'll just try and head them off quickly, just so that a few more people have had a say. That would be. Okay, cool.
Yeah, we have 2 more questions on the thing. Tracy has got a question about moving beyond fossil fuels.
Yes, we should definitely do that.
Yeah. If you'd like to unmute yourself, Tracy, and I'm going to ask it on Tracy's behalf. So, hi Tim, thanks for your book, Prosperity Without Growth, and look forward to reading your new one. My question is about the Paris Agreement. In the lead up to that, I understood that the discussions between North America, Europe, China, and Africa was because the first wanted the remainder of the carbon budget to be allocated based on current usage of the country, that the second wanted it on a per capita basis, and that the third wanted the allocation to take into account historic emissions. This argument seems to me within the paradigm, i.e. that using fossil fuels is the ideal way to develop. However, if this were the case, then North America, Europe would already be there. Since this became the paradigm within which negotiations happened, how could I have ever come up with the answers that were needed? I'd be grateful for your thoughts on this, or if you think that another thoughts. Yeah, I'm grateful for your thoughts on this, Tim.
Okay, do you want to throw another one at me? Just so I have a few to.
So Rhiannon, does capitalism limit our ability to plan for the future? She notices your references to Thoreau, who stated throughout this novel, Walden, that he was unable to live in a society because it was not living. Do you think that in this capitalist system which we live in, we are unable to live because we are living in a perpetual system, reactionary in a monetary driven world? Do you think this is why decisions that link to the future take so long to be decided upon, such as the climate crisis?
Okay, and one more, let's just do one more for luck.
What role can mental health professionals play in changing the capitalist outlook on individual societal basis?
Okay, cool. Let's cover the ground.
Yeah, that's kind of quick fire around there.
Yeah, so yes, on Paris and current usage and responsibility. I mean, I do think, you know, it has always been a profound principle of the climate negotiations, the idea of common but differentiated responsibilities. And it's always been, I think, too much sidelined from the discussion, particularly, I would argue, by the advanced economies who have not taken that idea of responsibility seriously. So, you know, the idea of historical responsibility is really important. It was really important to that discussion in Paris. It's been important throughout, I would argue, throughout the the history of the Climate Change Convention. And what was interesting about Paris was that, in fact, all of that pre-conference, negotiation was almost swept aside by an agreement that nobody had seen coming to put 1.5 degrees on the table, which was a much harsher timescale, much more difficult target, much faster emission reduction pathways, and tighter emission budgets. And that substantively changed the dialogue in a very, very unexpected way. And that gives me quite a lot of hope, actually, because we see that positioning of the different arguments around the COP26 that's coming up in Glasgow. And I think, what we should not really assume at this point is that those arguments and the sort of slightly congested way in which they're approaching COP26 is going to necessarily stop something unexpected happening. But I do absolutely agree with this idea that actually the position of the advanced economies in particular has to be one which adopts responsibility, accepts faster emission pathways, faster transition to net zero, and makes the lead in terms of transitioning the economic model, because it bears the brunt of the historical responsibility for the damage that capitalism has caused. So I think that, to me, is absolutely critical. On the question of, the point I took from this was, is capitalism going to continually constrain us into reacting to a dysfunctional system? I don't think it does. I don't think it has to. In some ways, and I point this out right at the beginning of the book, is we need a language to talk about where we are and a language to talk about what we want the world to be afterwards. And I acknowledge actually that even the language of post-growth is tied too firmly to the concept of growth, and life after capitalism is tied too firmly to the concept of capitalism. But I do think there's a process through which we turn our eyes to the problem and face it in a fairly dispassionate way in order to understand where the stumbling blocks are. And for me, some of those stumbling blocks are the ones that we've talked about, the conceptual ones, the value related ones that we've talked about this afternoon. And it seems to me that if we pay attention to those, they become the guides to the escape from capitalism that means that we don't have to spend our lives reacting to its dysfunctionality. We can actually build something that works, and we can do that from the bottom up. And wherever the future holds, that task is a valuable one. And on the question, I kind of like, in fact, that we're finishing with this question on mental health, because it does seem to me absolutely critical, not just because of the shadow pandemic of mental health that the WHO has recognized as being one of the legacies of COVID-19, but actually because at the heart of it, the human condition has to be about mental health. It has to be about the well-being of communities. It has to be about the well-being of relationships. It has to be about the well-being of individuals, and paying attention to that mental health, focusing on that mental health, understanding the places where it breaks down, not judging normality, but actually understanding difference across mental health and creating the conditions for good mental health is as much a part of finding the balance that I'm talking about as is finding the nutritional balance that allows us to be healthy organisms on a material planet. And in a way, it's also that space is the space which is quite literally unlimited. When we think about our psychological dimensions and our psychological possibilities, there is no material limit on those possibilities. There are institutional limits and social limits, and indeed the limits that individuals, as they adapt to adverse conditions in their lives, how they respond to those and the resources they have to respond to those matter. But the role of mental health professionals, and indeed of each and every one of us in paying attention to our mental health, is absolutely critical, crucial, it seems to me, to a transition in which we have unlimited possibilities for psychological progress, for psychological well-being, for social well-being, and indeed for a sense that the human condition is a place that allows us an unlimited place to grow in the future.
Amazing. That's a fantastic way to round up the seminar. I'm sure we could have been speaking for a long than that, but just like to round up and say thank you to Tim for that. I hope it's been aligned for everybody as much as it has been for me. And just a few last housekeeping things. Our next speaker for part of the seminar is going to be Sarah Renterini, who's from the group on Earth observations. She'll be talking about the role of remote sensing in informing policy in the context of climate change and biodiversity loss, and she was speaking on the 30th of June. So again, thank you very much to Tim, and thank you all very much for attending.
Thanks, Patrick. Thanks, Abigail.